Good morning, U.S. history students. It's Mr. Baker with you again. We're going to examine, in the time we have today, a very important event that very much defined American history for a lot of people. That event, of course, is the famous Vietnam War. We're going to look more today at the big objective that we associate with the political side of the way that this war affects our society to an extent. But we're also going to look a little bit more in today's lesson at the way that debate got kind of more involved about the direction of our Cold War policy related to Vietnam, and a little bit more particularly the debate about power. How does this war have kind of like this power, shall we say, situation between the Congress and then also particularly executive branch. So our objective here is we want to really examine that with some detail. Okay, I want you all to pause for just a moment and ask yourselves, what do I know about Vietnam? Give yourselves maybe 5 seconds to kind of generate any things that you know, ideas that come to mind, etc. And then we'll further our discussion or our lesson here in just a moment. Okay, did you have time to brainstorm anything? You might be a grandson, a granddaughter, a cousin, a nephew, a niece of somebody who was involved in the war, whether it was fighting abroad or whatever the case might be. And so what we understand, guys, about this in basic form is that this war does not just happen just to happen. All right. So it's a lot of things that are kind of unfolding. And the question is, where does a lot of this originate from? And we take a look, guys, at before America becomes more heavily involved. This actually goes back to the days of post-World War II. If you think about it, guys, there's a big movement in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, other parts of the world, but particularly those two areas really stand out a lot to us, of nationalism following World War II. Places want independence. They want autonomy. They want to have the ability to rule themselves, to self-rule, to self-govern. And in the case of French Indochina, aka Vietnam later on, that is by no means something that they were on the other side about. They want to be able to govern themselves. The downside is, as the name French Indochina would suggest, the French are not really willing at this point to give up their stake, their colonial presence, whatever you want to call it, and of course, Vietnam, eventually Vietnam. And so what happens? Well, they fight this considerable conflict called the French Indochina War between about 1946 and 1954. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, well, where's the United States during this conflict? Well, we're observing. We're not heavily involved in what's going on at this point in time. Truman does have some things to say about it. But where you're going to notice a bit more importance here is when this war is coming to an end, this part of Asia is going to be kind of like in this crossroads, not identical, but in some cases similar to the division of Korea. If you remember the 30th parallel between North and South Korea, eventually they have a big meeting called the Geneva Accord. The Geneva Accords, pardon me, in 1954. And what did they decide to do? They decided to actually divide Vietnam into the North and the South. Okay, so this is where you're going to have the leadership. Now, probably the more well-known name in the history of Vietnam would definitely be Ho Chi Minh. He's seen as kind of like the almost like the father, if you will, of Vietnam. Who do we call the father of America? We call that usually George Washington. Okay, so this guy is pretty important. And so he's going to be, more, shall we say, involved in North Vietnam. They establish a capital called Ho Chi Minh. We'll look at that on the map. And it is going to be more of a, Ho Chi Minh is the leader. The capital is going to be Hanoi. Pardon me on that, guys. And then also this government is going to be more pro-communist. Now, you can probably already see that there is a division brewing here between folks that are going to be on a communist side and folks that are going to be on a more democratic side. And so South Vietnam is going to be divided at that 17th parallel below there. And that's where we're going to have the leadership of New Dinh Diem. And he's going to be basically taking over the part of Vietnam that the capital is Saigon. Saigon becomes an important city later on. As a lot of you might know, it became, after the fall of Saigon in 1975, It's going to be renamed eventually to what is called Ho Chi Minh City, which it still is called that today. It's going to be supported by the United States. Now, let's face the facts. Diem was not, in a lot of people's eyes, guys, a saint. He is a bit more, I guess, in tune with Western ideals. He was educated in the West. I want to say he was a Roman Catholic. So therefore, he doesn't really maybe have as much in common with some of the people. He also was, a guy that you could argue was not exactly, a saint, but nonetheless, he was not a professed communist, and therefore, as a result, you have a lot of American support. Okay, why is that a big deal? Well, if you take a look, guys, at the geography of the region, you'll notice that this is what we call Southeast Asia. You've got North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and all those areas, guys, if you think about it, are really pretty close to American interests in this region. You go north of there, you have China, and then eventually Taiwan, South Korea. And so what do we notice? We notice that this becomes a hotbed. Now, why does America obviously take a larger position? This is where you move into how this war, guys, is very much going to span over a very large amount of presidencies, from Eisenhower, Truman to an extent, John F. Kennedy. LBJ is going to be the person that's given a lot of attention with the escalation of the conflict. Nixon, which we'll look at more in a moment, and then also with the fall of Saigon, obviously the leadership of President Ford. He's only in office for, what was it, about a little bit less than a year when that happened, actually. Okay, but that's an issue for later. So when you're looking at basic U.S. involvement, guys, the biggest thing is the first thing I should say is the idea of the domino theory. Now, when you all think of playing dominoes, you probably think of you flick one and all the other ones topple down. Well, in the case of Eisenhower, pretty much what he's looking at, guys, is if North Vietnam is already communist and South Vietnam are to become communist, then you're going to basically have the falling down of all these dominoes. So this is kind of a theory, if you will, that Eisenhower, I don't know if the right word is came up with, but certainly thought it was a supportive idea of his, that if one other country pretty much in this region especially fell to communism, that the other regimes or governments, if you will, would fall kind of like in a certain pattern. Okay. And so we see Americans getting involved. We see, transition or passing the torch to Kennedy. Kennedy is going to further support American advisory role in the Vietnam area. When we say advisory, we're talking more about training, supporting, not as much what you would call boots on the ground, kind of actual fighting, like in the manholes and things like that. Obviously some of the jungle things that you come across. But the question is, what is the difference? The big difference is the level of direct involvement, depending on what you define direct to be. Okay. There's a school of thought out there that Kennedy was not in favor of really kind of escalating this conflict to a larger extent. We don't know for sure as far as like what he would have done had he maybe had a second term. Keep in mind his untimely death, in November 1963 is pretty big. But what we do know is that when basically LBJ or Lyndon B. Johnson takes office, guys, what we find is that Johnson's administration, is going to become heavily, heavily involved and also connected to the Vietnam War. Okay. And so that big thing about how this kind of creates a power thing goes back to the next slide. We'll come back to the previous one in a moment. So what brings the president to have more, shall we say, control in this war? And it's going to be an event that we call the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, if you're not real familiar with the geography, basically, guys, if you take a look at this map here, the Gulf of Tonkin, as you can see, is a waterway right to the east of North Vietnam. Just a real quick story on this. So allegedly, there was an American, gunship in the region. There was evidently a firing, at least the argument is, by a North Vietnamese ship. What happens? Of course, the question is that taking action to try to escalate a war? Well, guess what happens? The Congress basically is going to pass what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution, if we have time and if you're in your class session, remember these are optional, but they're encouraged if you want to kind of go a step further with these documents and ideas, guys. But basically, what Congress does in a sense is that they pass this, basically passing on a lot of, shall we say, power for the president to do things like organizing the draft differently, escalating the conflict. In other words, taking a more directive manner with the war. And the question is, what does LBJ basically do? Well, first of all, to a large extent, he's going to be associated with the idea of escalation. Okay, so this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that's one of the more important things of today's lesson, guys, is basically going to transfer a great deal of power to the president with, the idea of military power, again, objective, guys, and then also the idea of even foreign policy. And so about a year into his term, a little bit over that, when he's reelected, 1965 rolls around, and he basically makes a decision to launch what was called the Campaign of Rolling Thunder. If you're kind of wondering what is Rolling Thunder, basically the nuts and bolts of this, guys, is a big bombing campaign toward North Vietnam. Okay, so basically what he's trying to do here is that he's trying to basically force, I don't know if I would say a quick surrender, but certainly one that would be, not long and drawn out. And the answer is that doesn't really work. All right, so pretty much his second term from 1965 to 1969, he's going to be trying to figure out what is a good way to manage this war and what is a good way to try to bring an end to it. There are some ideas on the table about what to do with trying to have peace and things like that. However, LBJ in 1968 could have ran for another term, but he actually made it clear to his party, remember he was a Democrat, he said to them in a live televised address that he would not actually accept their nomination for the 68 campaign. Okay, so unfortunately depending on how you look at it, that leaves several different candidates, Nixon of which is going to win the election eventually, that actually have to make a pretty big amount of decision about how they're going to go about it. Nixon eventually is going to pledge, after he does some things we'll talk about in a moment, to actually have what he refers to as "quote unquote" peace with honor. Okay, so I want you to think about that. When you have this amount of involvement, okay, you can clearly see what we're talking about here. 1964 rolls around, and you're noticing, again, most of those 23,300 troops are mostly advisors. Again, going back to Kennedy and even Eisenhower to an extent. And then what do we notice with the president kind of having more direct control? We're noticing a larger escalation of American forces in Vietnam. All right, and you can clearly see that. I mean, you're looking at huge number of changes. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, okay, why do these numbers start to go down after 1968? We'll get to that in a moment, but part of that is going to be Nixon's strategy that he actually tries to kind of implement. There's a lot of different schools of thought out there about Nixon's strategy. Was he trying to escalate? Was he basically trying to do other things? We'll get to that more in a moment. But again, the question comes up, when you extend the president this much power, control, and authority, the question, ladies and gentlemen, is that a good thing if there's not as many checks and balances? This is where Congress basically responds about 9 years later with this War Powers Act, or resolution, if you will, of 1973. Okay. And so a lot of you might be wondering, okay, well, what exactly does this do? Well, this is actually, again, going back to that debate, was this Gulf of Tonkin resolution a really good idea to extend that much power or authority to the president with military? The Congress came to the conclusion almost a decade later that this was exhibiting too much power and control. Okay, now that's not to say that the president, guys, still does not have powers such as, commander-in-chief. He does, right? That's in the Constitution, Article 2. But where this becomes really important is, if I'm the president and I can send troops or military wherever I want, and there's not really that congressional oversight or at least communication. The Congress guys is going to argue that was not the best use of executive power. Okay, this escalation, the numbers, the dire situation it created. And so what this War Powers Resolution or Act does is it says, Mr. President, you still have power. You can still send troops abroad, but one, you have to inform us in about a 48-hour period of time. So you have about 2 days to do it, to inform us as Congress. And then Congress has 60 days. Now, guys, you might want to pause this for a moment and write that down. Congress has 60 days to decide what they want to basically do. Do they want to support presidential action moving forward? Do they want to basically say, no, that's not really something that we as Congress feel is the right move? That is a big thing. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, well, who's in office in 1973? It's Nixon. All right. And Nixon does not exactly want to give up this power and authority. All right. You could argue that he's kind of entered into what some historians call this imperial presidency. Okay. And so he vetoes this act, but both houses of Congress, a lot of you guys have heard of the idea of a veto override. They said, we still feel very strongly about this. The president has too much authority. You know what? We're going to basically make sure that we can override this. And both houses of Congress had the necessary 2/3 to actually override it. This becomes a law. It still very much impacts the way that the president must do things. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, okay, well, Mr. Baker, what does that mean about the nature of Vietnam? If you go back to the Korean War, we called that a lot of times a police action. This is very similar to the idea, guys, of this police action kind of power in relationship between the president and the Congress. Okay, so that is a really important thing for us to really keep in mind. Okay, Nixon is going to start to reduce troop numbers. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, well, how does he present that to the American people? He presents this as what we know as a policy that's nicknamed Vietnamization, okay, which basically is kind of a fancy way, guys, of saying that we're going to start to withdraw American troops. But in order to basically make that effective, we're going to be, trying to train these trained South Vietnamese to actually be in a position where they can actually be able to do what's called taking the reins, okay? And the thing, guys, that you notice is that by 1968, there's not really a lot of, shall we say, the whole population is not really on board entirely with continuing the conflict. So there's a lot of debate there. Okay, you've had the Tet Offensive that the media has basically presented as a dire failure. You've got several other incidents that are pretty big. The My Lai Massacre. All right, I'll show you a picture on that in a second. And so all these things are leading us to this idea in 1968 of Nixon and so forth, saying we have to basically start to de-escalate. Now, Nixon gets into some, shall we say, criticism because he does support the idea of at least trying to, let's say, protect American interests, and he actually decided to bomb Cambodia, which, as you can see, is right there. Okay. Now, he justifies this as saying that, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which goes through this part of Cambodia, is providing resources and things like that. Americans are basically in shall we say, harm's way. There's a case to be made that in some people's eyes, bombing a country that's been pretty neutral, at least in theory, perhaps, does not exactly pose the best way of de-escalation. And as you can imagine, you're going to see a lot of major university protests. Okay, so you have people, again, a lot of students, a lot of society people that are basically, on the side of the fence that are basically anti-war. Okay, and Kent State, which is in Ohio, you can research this in more depth if you would like to, but that's going to be one of the bigger incidents. But 4 students actually died because of the firing of the National Guard. Okay, but at the end of the day, what's going to happen? Nixon is going to have to own up to this. And eventually, that's where he's going to say, okay, enough is enough. We're going to try to have peace with honor. We're going to withdraw. It's time for these countries or these two sides to actually kind of try to come to some peace on their own as well. Now, the thing to keep in mind, guys, is that this Paris Peace Accords of 1973, while this does in the larger aspect of American military involvement, it does not technically end the war between the North and the South entirely. Okay, so that's the reason why after Nixon is out of office, probably after his resignation, and of course we have Ford in office. Ford, again in 1975, is going to have to make a decision when it's pretty much given that Saigon is going to fall. Okay, and he could have sent additional troops over there. The question I want y'all to ponder is, why wouldn't he do that? And some people would say, well, to a lot of people, it's, he had this idea that we can't win the war. I don't know if that's the bigger reason why, but remember the War Powers Resolution. He understands that he's not going to have the congressional support to actually be able to get the troops to stay there longer term. Okay, now you could say part of that is the Congress feels like perhaps we fought too long. The other side of it is, remember, there's a lot of people that are very bitter toward his pardon of President Nixon. We'll look at that more in a future lesson. And so what we notice is the question a lot of people have is, what lesson did we learn from Vietnam? And I'll end you with this quote by President Ford to ponder before we move on with the rest of our lesson. Okay, guys, so I asked you all to think about, okay, what lessons could we say were learned? I know this is a quick overview, but I think it's interesting that President Ford, who was in office at the time, had something very important to say about this. This document here is something that we're just going to introduce right now. But look what he says. I think there are a number of lessons that we can learn from Vietnam. One, that we have to work with other governments that feel as we do that what? Freedom is vitally important. Okay. That is obviously essential to understand American ideals, political ideals, freedom. Now, as you can imagine, as we looked at last week, the civil rights movement is going on. King has a lot to say, hey, we're sending Americans abroad to support civil rights and things like that, and freedoms and all these different things that we associate with democracy. Yet we have similar battles in Southwest Georgia, which is basically, kind of like his area or his turf, if you will. So it makes a lot of sense why there's going to be some backlash against this. But look at what Ford says further. We cannot, however, fight their battles for them. Those countries who believe in freedom as we do must carry the burden. Okay, we can help them, not with U.S. military personnel, but with arms and economic aid so that they can protect their own national interest and protect the freedom of their citizens. Think about what you might interpret he's getting at there, and we'll talk about that. But one thing to think about, guys, particularly is he saying that America is no longer committed to the ideals and carrying them through? That's something for us to maybe think about if you all want to talk about that in our whole class session, if you can attend. I think we also may have learned some lessons concerning how we, meaning the United States, would conduct a military operation. There was, of course, from the period of 1961 or 1962, again, that was the time period of John F. Kennedy, guys, through the end of our military involvement in Vietnam, a great deal of controversy whether the military operations in Vietnam were carried out in a proper way. Some dispute between the civilian and military leaders as to the proper prosecution of a military engagement. I think we can learn something from those differences. And if we ever become engaged in any military operation in the future, and I hope we don't, I trust we've learned something about how we should handle such an operation. Okay. Now, some of you might be wondering, what exactly might he be getting at with our conduct? Think about what we mean by that, and we'll come back to that in just a moment as we wrap up the big picture of Vietnam. Okay, guys, so I asked you all to ponder, what is Ford perhaps getting at with our conduct? And a lot of that, guys, if you don't know this war, talking about Vietnam, is to a lot of people known as the first true living room war. We have televisions that are basically bringing this into the the living rooms and the homes of people. And one of the famous figures that has done that is a gentleman by the name of Walter Cronkite. All right. Now he was a well-known news anchor presence. You know, his title, the most trusted man in America. People loved the guy. A lot of people did, and they took what he said at face value. And what we notice, guys, about this is a couple of things that really stand out entering the late 60s and the early 70s. First of all, the controversy that we associate with what became known as the My Lai massacre. Okay, if you take a look at my cursor, this was publicized, I think it was around 1968, where Americans basically, as the name massacre suggests, went into a village. Now, there's debate about was the village harboring the Viet Cong or the Viet Minh. All right, Viet Cong would have been the communist sympathizers in South Vietnam. Well, whether that was the case or not, the fact of the matter is you can clearly see, you see children, you see women, you see the elderly that are basically, killed. A lot of Americans are exposed to this again on live TV. They start to basically question, are we acting as a dignified country with how we're conducting this war? Now, this is where also, guys, the Tet Offensive is also going to become highly important in 1968. Okay, keep in mind, this is going to be some of the heights of what we're seeing with protests and movements toward other things we'll look at. But what's the one thing we noticed about the Tet Offensive? It was, as you can see here, I think it was over 100 cities, towns. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong actually organized a series of raids to basically try to really throw America and also the South Vietnamese trained troops off guard. If you're kind of wondering what is really the Tet, it's kind of the celebration of their New Year. So it's obviously a holiday, right? It's kind of like our New Year or something like that. And the argument is, guys, is that when the media covered this, all right, again, we know that the media is a really influential outlet, that they basically present it as America really being defeated. Whereas you can make a strong argument that actually America stood ground. We basically held our ground. We remember we don't leave until 1973, but there's a case to be made that this was misrepresented by our media. And so again, Americans start to actually have this idea that we actually were not really carrying forth, or at least honoring the goals, or at least being able to do that. Now, the last thing I want to cover just really quick is the last bit of information with really the executive branch, and that is the big court case that came out of this that we call the New York Times versus United States. As you can see, this is in 1971. Now, there's a big question out there with things that are supposed to be top secret. What should Americans know about our involvement in Vietnam? Okay, because keep in mind, in 1971, late 60s, all of these things, Americans are still over there, they're still fighting, they're still serving the nation, whether they're drafted, whether they're actually there because they're already part of the military. And so what happens is the New York Times starts to publish a series of documents that became associated as what we call the Pentagon Papers. These papers, if you want to read all the documents, the nutshell of it is that the government, you could argue we deceived the public perhaps, but the big thing beyond that is that they did not really tell the American people the whole story about why we were over there in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you can imagine, guys, these papers, they cost money because it's a government document. And when they start to actually get exposed to these, the Americans are starting to question things. Okay, now who's in office in 1971? Nixon is. Okay, and again, he clearly does not want this exposed. And so therefore, as you can imagine, he's got a lot to say about these leaks, which we'll look at more with the Watergate scandal with another way of looking at that. What happens? Well, the Supreme Court has to decide. Should this be considered somewhat public knowledge, or should it be considered something that should have not been made available? Guess who they sided with? The New York Times. And so again, we're looking at that concept, guys, of the people becoming somewhat distrustworthy, and this is not going to bode well for the nation moving forward. Okay. The fall of Saigon in 1975, which I'll end with, brings to the attention of a lot of people, guys, the big picture question, which is, what is the legacy of Vietnam? Now, you could say, well, we still have to evaluate things moving forward. Okay. Yes, that's true. But, guys, there's a scene where when the Americans are actually leaving our embassy, and I'll end with this story, guys. And basically, we're taking, the folks that were still there, our embassy is kind of like our diplomatic headquarters. And the question is, when we left there, and pretty much all of Vietnam is now going to be under one, government. It's not divided anymore like Korea still is. The question is, how should this be remembered? I want to lead that with you so that if you have an opportunity to attend the class session where we address these documents in more detail, we can actually further that conversation. I hope you're doing well. Make sure you've read a good bit of this in your text. And as always, if you have any questions or thoughts or needs, feel free to email me. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you later in the week. If not, have a great one, and I will see you soon. Take care.